The emergency room waiting area was sterile and cold, much like the voices of my 3 children when they told me they were too busy for my drama, just hours before I collapsed in my kitchen. As I sat there clutching my chest, struggling to breathe, all I could think about was the stack of medical bills that would soon arrive at their doorsteps. They wanted distance from my so-called drama? Well, they were about to get more drama than they ever bargained for. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Patricia Williams, and at 67, I thought I had raised 3 wonderful children who would stand by me through anything. Michael, my eldest at 42, was a successful software engineer in Portland. Sarah, 39, worked as a marketing executive in Denver. And my youngest, David, 35, had just made partner at a law firm in Chicago. All of them had done well for themselves, married into good families, and given me beautiful grandchildren I rarely got to see. The warning signs had been there for months, but every time I tried to reach out to my children about my declining health, I was met with the same response. Michael would sigh heavily into the phone and tell me he was in the middle of a crucial project deadline. Sarah would cut our conversation short, claiming her twins needed her attention for some school event. David, my baby, would barely return my calls at all, and when he did, he spoke to me like I was an inconvenience, interrupting his important legal work. It all started 6 months ago when I began experiencing chest pains and shortness of breath. At first, I thought it was just stress from living alone in the house where I'd raised my children after their father, Robert, passed away 8 years earlier. The house felt too big, too quiet, and sometimes I wondered if the ache in my chest was just loneliness masquerading as something more serious. I made an appointment with Dr. Henderson, my longtime physician, who immediately ordered a series of tests: blood work, an EKG, a stress test, and finally a cardiac catheterization that revealed significant blockages in 3 of my major arteries. The diagnosis was clear: I needed triple bypass surgery, and soon. The cardiologist, Dr. Maria Santos, explained that without intervention, I was looking at a massive heart attack that would likely be fatal. When I called Michael first with the news, his response still echoes in my mind like a slap across the face. "Mom, you've been complaining about chest pains for years. Remember when you thought you were having a heart attack during Sarah's wedding? It turned out to be acid reflux. I'm sure this is just another false alarm." I tried to explain that this was different, that Dr. Santos had shown me the actual blockages on the screen, but Michael interrupted me. "Look, I'm dealing with a major software launch right now. Can we talk about this next week? I'm sure whatever it is can wait a few days." Sarah's reaction was even worse. When I reached her that evening, she sounded irritated before I even began speaking. "Mom, please tell me you're not calling about more medical drama. Jessica has a piano recital tomorrow, and I still need to get her dress altered. I literally don't have time for this right now." I pushed forward anyway, explaining about the surgery, about how scared I was, about how I needed my family. "Mom, you're being dramatic again. Remember last year when you were convinced you had diabetes because you felt tired? It turned out you just needed new reading glasses. I think you need to stop watching so many medical shows and find some hobbies." David, my youngest, the one I'd sacrificed the most for, putting him through law school by working double shifts at the department store, delivered the final blow. "Mom, I love you, but you've got to stop with all this health anxiety. Every month it's something new. My firm is up for a major case right now, and I can't afford any distractions. Maybe you should consider seeing a therapist about your hypochondria instead of constantly running to doctors." Hypochondria. My own son, a man I'd raised to be compassionate and intelligent, had just dismissed my genuine medical emergency as a mental health issue. The hurt went deeper than any chest pain I'd experienced. For 3 weeks, I tried calling them back, leaving voicemails explaining that the surgery was scheduled, that I was frightened, that I didn't want to go through this alone. Michael sent a brief text saying he was swamped with work. Sarah responded with a generic "hope everything works out" message. David didn't respond at all. The night before my surgery, I sat in my kitchen making final preparations. I'd arranged for my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, to water my plants and collect my mail. I'd given detailed instructions to my cat, Whiskers, as if he could understand the gravity of the situation. And then I did something that would change everything. I pulled out my laptop and began typing a letter that I would leave with my attorney, Jonathan Mills. Jonathan had been a friend of Robert's and had handled our family's legal matters for over 20 years. He was one of the few people who knew the full extent of my financial situation, something my children had never bothered to ask about. The letter was simple and direct. Since my children considered my health concerns to be drama and were too busy to be involved in my medical care, I was removing them as beneficiaries of my life insurance policies and redirecting those funds to cover my mounting medical expenses. Additionally, I was changing the terms of my will to reflect their lack of involvement in my health crisis. But that wasn't all. I also included instructions for Jonathan to send my medical bills directly to each of my children's homes, with a note explaining that since they were too busy to support me emotionally through my health crisis, perhaps they could help support me financially instead. Every cardiology appointment, every test, every medication, every day in the hospital, all of it would be documented and forwarded to their addresses. The surgery itself was more complicated than anyone had anticipated. What should have been a routine triple bypass turned into a 6-hour ordeal when they discovered additional blockages and scar tissue from a previous, undiagnosed heart attack I'd apparently suffered months earlier. Dr. Santos later told me that if I'd waited even another week, I likely wouldn't have survived. I spent 4 days in the ICU, conscious but unable to speak due to the ventilator. During those 4 days, I had plenty of time to think about my children's response to my medical crisis and about the choices I'd made in my letter to Jonathan. Mrs. Chen visited every day, bringing news from the neighborhood and updates on Whiskers. My mailman George even stopped by to check on me. But my hospital room remained notably free of my own children. On the 5th day, as I was being moved to a regular room, my phone finally rang. It was Michael, and his voice carried a tone I'd never heard before, panic mixed with anger and something that might have been fear. "Mom, what the hell is going on? I just got a bill for $15,000 from Pacific Northwest Cardiology with a note saying you wanted me to see what your drama actually costs." I was still weak from surgery, my voice barely above a whisper, but I managed to respond. "Hello, Michael. I'm recovering from my triple bypass surgery. You know, the one you said was probably another false alarm." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long I thought he might have hung up. Finally, he spoke again, his voice smaller now. "Triple bypass? Mom, I thought you were just having anxiety again. Why didn't you tell me it was serious?" The irony was so thick I almost laughed, which would have been painful given the fresh incisions across my chest. "I tried to tell you, sweetheart. I called you 3 times about the surgery. You told me you were too busy with work to deal with my medical drama. But I didn't know it was actual surgery. I thought you were talking about more tests, more doctor visits that would turn out to be nothing." I could hear,
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
the desperation creeping into his voice, the slow realization that he'd made a terrible mistake. But I wasn't ready to let him off the hook yet. "Michael, I specifically told you that Dr. Santos said I needed triple bypass surgery. I told you I was scared. I asked you to come be with me." "I know, but you've said you were scared before, and it always turned out to be nothing serious." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on my hospital room door. A nurse entered with more medication and a wheelchair, explaining that I needed to go for a follow-up chest x-ray. I told Michael the first had to go and would call him back later. But before I could call him back, Sarah called me, her voice high-pitched with hysteria. "Mom, I just got the most insane medical bill in the mail. $17,000 for something called cardiac catheterization? And there's a note saying this is what drama looks like. What is happening?" I explained again about the surgery, about the diagnosis, about the fact that I'd tried to tell her weeks ago. Like Michael, she seemed genuinely shocked that the medical crisis had been real. "But Mom, you're always worried about something. Last year you were convinced you had early onset dementia because you forgot where you put your car keys." "Sarah, there's a difference between forgetting where I put my keys and having 3 major arteries blocked by 90%. The fact that you can't distinguish between those two things is exactly why I've been feeling so alone in this. David called later that evening, his voice tight with what I recognized as his courtroom tone. Mom, I need to understand what's happening here. I've received several medical bills with notes suggesting that I'm financially responsible for your health care. As your son, and as an attorney, I need to tell you that you can't legally make your children responsible for your medical debts. You're absolutely right, David, I replied calmly. I can't legally make you responsible for my medical debts, but I can choose to share the financial burden with the children who couldn't be bothered to share the emotional burden. That's not fair, Mom. You know how demanding my job is right now. What's not fair, David, is raising a son for 35 years, working double shifts to put him through law school, and then having that son tell me I'm being dramatic when I'm facing life-threatening surgery. The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, David spoke again, his lawyer voice replaced by something much younger and more uncertain. You really had surgery? Actual heart surgery? Triple bypass, sweetie. They cracked my chest open and rerouted blood flow around 3 blocked arteries. The surgeon said if I'd waited another week, I would have died. I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the phone. Mom, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize it was that serious. But why didn't you just tell us more clearly what was happening? The question hit me like another slap. David, I told you exactly what was happening. The problem wasn't my communication. The problem was that you'd already decided anything I said about my health was just drama, so you stopped listening. Over the next few days, as I slowly recovered in the hospital, my children began calling more frequently. Each conversation followed a similar pattern. They would express shock at the seriousness of my condition, apologize for not understanding, and then try to shift the conversation to the medical bills I'd been forwarding to their homes. Michael flew in from Portland, showing up at my hospital room with flowers and a face full of guilt. He looked older than his 42 years, with new lines around his eyes and a slight tremor in his hands as he set the bouquet on my bedside table. Mom, I'm so sorry, he began, settling into the uncomfortable hospital chair beside my bed. I had no idea how serious this was. I thought you were just being anxious again. I studied my eldest son's face, seeing the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, but also seeing the man who had dismissed my fears when I needed him most. Michael, can I ask you something? When did you stop trusting me? The question seemed to catch him off guard. What do you mean? When did you decide that everything I told you about my health was automatically an exaggeration or a cry for attention? Because there was a time when you believed me when I said I wasn't feeling well. He shifted uncomfortably in the chair, unable to meet my eyes. I guess it started after Dad died. You seemed so anxious about everything, and there were a few times when you thought something was seriously wrong, but it turned out to be minor. A few times over 8 years, Michael. And now, the one time something was genuinely life-threatening, you assumed I was crying wolf. I know, and I'm sorry. But Mom, this thing with the medical bills, sending them to our houses, that's not okay. It feels like you're trying to punish us. I reached for the water cup on my bedside table, taking a slow sip before responding. The movement pulled at my chest incisions, reminding me of the physical reality of what I'd been through. Michael, I'm not trying to punish you. I'm trying to help you understand the real cost of dismissing someone's health concerns. Every one of those bills represents a moment when I was scared and alone. When I needed my family and they were too busy to care. But we do care, Mom. We've always cared about you. Caring and showing care are two different things, sweetheart. When I called you about my chest pains, you cared enough to be annoyed that I was interrupting your work. When I told you about the surgery, you cared enough to assume I was being dramatic. That's not the kind of caring I needed. Michael broke down then, tears streaming down his face as he finally grasped the magnitude of what had happened. I could have lost you. You could have died. And the last conversation we had, I told you to stop being dramatic. I reached out with my free hand and touched his face, feeling the stubble that reminded me he'd rushed to catch a flight without taking time to shave. But I didn't die, Michael. I'm here, and you're here. and we have a chance to do better going forward." Sarah arrived the next day, her usual perfectly composed appearance, slightly disheveled from travel and stress. She'd brought my favorite chocolates and a stack of magazines, but I could see the guilt written across her face before she even spoke. "Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation, about how I responded when you told me about the surgery," she began, settling into the chair Michael had vacated. "I keep replaying it in my mind, and I can't believe how dismissive I was." "Sarah, I understand that you have a busy life. I know the twins keep you running in a dozen different directions. But when I told you I was having heart surgery, that wasn't the time to tell me about Jessica's piano recital." She winced at the reminder. "I know. I was so focused on all the little daily stresses that I couldn't see the real crisis right in front of me. But Mom, sending those medical bills to our house, it scared Jessica and Jordan. They saw the amounts and started asking if Grandma was dying." "And what did you tell them?" "I told them that Grandma had been sick, but she was getting better now. But Jordan asked why nobody told him that Grandma was in the hospital, and I didn't know what to say. The pain in my chest wasn't entirely physical anymore. The thought of my grandchildren learning about my surgery from medical bills rather than from family conversations highlighted just how disconnected we'd all become. Sarah, I never wanted the children to find out about my surgery that way, but I also never wanted to have surgery without my own children knowing what was happening. I know, and I'm sorry, but this bill thing has to stop. It's causing problems in my marriage. Kevin is upset about getting medical bills for someone else, and he's asking questions about our family finances." I studied my daughter's face, recognizing the same self-centered anxiety that had characterized her response to my health crisis. Even now, sitting beside my hospital bed, she was primarily concerned about how my medical emergency was affecting her life. "Sarah, those bills aren't a prank or a punishment, they're a reality check. Every single one of those charges represents part of what it cost to save my life, because my children were too busy to be involved in preserving it. But Mom, you can't expect us to pay for your medical care. We have our own families to support." "I don't expect you to pay for my medical care, sweetheart. I expect you to care about my medical care. There's a difference." David was the last to visit, arriving 3 days later with an expensive flower arrangement and the kind of serious expression he probably used when meeting with important clients. He'd always been the most emotionally guarded of my children, even as a little boy, but his detachment had grown more pronounced since he'd become successful. "Mom, I've been reviewing the situation," he began, pulling out a yellow legal pad covered with notes. "I think there's been a fundamental miscommunication here about expectations and responsibilities." I almost laughed at his formal tone. Even visiting his recovering mother in the hospital, David couldn't drop his lawyer persona. "David, sit down and talk to me like I'm your mother, not like I'm a client." He set the legal pad aside and took the chair, but his posture remained rigid. "Mom, I've spoken with Michael and Sarah, and we all agree that we should have been more supportive during your health crisis. But we also think that sending medical bills to our homes was an inappropriate response." "Inappropriate for whom?" "Well, for all of us. It's caused stress in our marriages, confusion for the grandchildren, and frankly, it's put all of us in an awkward position financially." I felt a familiar surge of disappointment. Even now, even sitting beside my hospital bed where I was recovering from major surgery, David was more concerned about the inconvenience to his life than the crisis in mine. "David, do you understand what triple bypass surgery means?" "Of course. It's a cardiac procedure to reroute blood flow around blocked arteries." "Do you understand that people die from the condition I had?" "Yes, I understand the medical significance." "Do you understand that I could have died alone because my 3 children were too busy to take my health concerns seriously?" For the first time since he'd arrived, David's composure cracked slightly. "Mom, we didn't know it was that serious." "You didn't know because you didn't listen. When I called you about the chest pains, you told me to see a therapist about my hypochondria. When I told you about the surgery, you said you couldn't afford any distractions from work. I remember the conversations differently. David, you're a lawyer. You should understand the importance of accurate documentation." I reached for my phone and scrolled through my recent calls. Would you like me to play back the voicemail you left me after I told you about the surgery? The one where you said I needed to stop creating drama and find some hobbies? His face went pale. You kept the voicemail? I kept all of them. Every dismissive comment. Every time one of you told me I was being dramatic. Every time you said you were too busy to talk about my health. I documented everything because I knew that someday you'd try to rewrite history to make yourselves feel better. The room fell silent, except for the beeping of the heart monitor attached to my chest. David stared at his hands, finally understanding that his mother had been keeping score all along. Mom, I don't know what you want from us now. We've apologized. We've acknowledged that we should have been more supportive. What else can we do? I looked at my youngest son, this man I'd sacrificed so much for, and realized that he still didn't understand the real issue. David, I don't want anything from you now. The time when I needed something from you was 6 weeks ago when I was facing surgery alone. That opportunity has passed. So what happens now? Do we just pretend this whole medical bill thing didn't happen? What happens now is that you all learn to live with the consequences of your choices. The bills I sent, you weren't about money, David. They were about helping you understand the real cost of dismissing someone's pain. But we can't actually be held responsible for your medical debts. You're right. Legally, you have no responsibility for my medical debts. Just like legally, I have no responsibility to leave you anything in my will. The threat hung in the air between us, unspoken but clearly understood. David's eyes widened as he grasped the implication of my words. Mom, you're not talking about changing your will because we didn't handle this situation perfectly, are you? I'm talking about the fact that adult children who are too busy to support their mother through a health crisis might also be too busy to manage an inheritance responsibly. As I watched David process this information, I realized that my recovery from surgery was about more than healing my heart. It was about healing the relationships that had been damaged by years of taking each other for granted. The next morning, Dr. Santos cleared me for discharge, but not before sitting down for a serious conversation about my recovery and ongoing care. Mrs. Williams, your surgery was successful, but you'll need significant lifestyle changes and ongoing monitoring. Do you have family support at home? I glanced at the empty chair where my children had taken turns, sitting for brief guilt-laden visits. I have some family nearby, but I'm not sure how involved they'll be in my recovery. I'm concerned about that. Heart surgery recovery requires both physical and emotional support. Patients who feel isolated or unsupported have significantly higher rates of complications and depression. Doctor, if my children couldn't be bothered to support me through the surgery itself, I don't have high expectations for their involvement in my recovery. Dr. Santos frowned, making notes in my chart. Mrs. Williams, I'm going to recommend that you consider cardiac rehabilitation classes and possibly a support group for heart surgery patients. You shouldn't have to go through this recovery alone. As she left my room, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in just 1 week. I'd gone into surgery hoping my children would rally around me, and instead I'd discovered just how little priority my well-being held in their busy lives. But I'd also discovered my own strength and my willingness to demand the respect I deserved. Jonathan Mills, my attorney, arrived later that morning to drive me home and discuss the legal changes I'd requested before surgery. Jonathan was a distinguished man in his 70s. With silver hair and the kind of gentle manner that made people trust him immediately. Patricia, I have to ask if you're certain about these changes to your will and insurance policies, he said as we drove through the familiar streets of my neighborhood. Your children seem genuinely remorseful about their behavior during your health crisis. Jonathan, remorse after the fact doesn't undo the damage of being dismissed when I needed them most. I spent weeks trying to reach out to them about my surgery, and they all made it clear that my health concerns were an inconvenience to their busy lives. But people make mistakes, especially when they're stressed about their own responsibilities. I watched the houses in my neighborhood pass by, thinking about all the families inside who probably did a better job of supporting each other through medical crises than mine had. Jonathan, this wasn't a mistake. This was a pattern. Every time I've had health concerns since Robert died, my children have responded with irritation and dismissal. They've trained themselves to see me as a hypochondriac rather than as a person with legitimate medical needs. What do you hope to accomplish with these changes? I hope to accomplish exactly what I've already accomplished. I wanted my children to understand the real cost of dismissing someone's health concerns, and the medical bills I sent them have done that. I wanted them to experience some consequences for their behavior, and the anxiety they've felt about those bills has done that too. Quote, Jonathan pulled into my driveway, where Mrs. Chen was waiting on my front porch with Whiskers in her arms. Seeing my neighbor's concerned face and my cat's familiar orange fur brought the first genuine smile I'd felt in weeks. And the will changes? Jonathan asked. The will changes stay in place until my children demonstrate that they've actually learned something from this experience. If they can show me that they're capable of prioritizing my well-being over their own convenience, then we can discuss restoring their inheritance. How will you measure that? I thought about Dr. Santos's warnings about the importance of support during recovery, about the long months of cardiac rehabilitation ahead of me, about the ongoing medical appointments and lifestyle changes I'd need to navigate. Jonathan, I'm about to find out exactly how much my children have learned about supporting someone through a health crisis. My recovery will be their test. As I walked slowly up the path to my front door, feeling the pull of fresh surgical incisions with each step, I realized that my real healing was just beginning. The surgery had repaired my heart, but rebuilding my relationships with my children would require a different kind of operation entirely. Mrs. Chen helped me settle back into my house, bringing casseroles she'd prepared and filling me in on neighborhood news I'd missed during my hospital stay. As evening approached and I sat in my favorite chair with Whiskers purring on my lap, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. My phone rang, and I saw Sarah's number on the screen. For the first time in weeks, I actually wanted to answer her call. Hi, Mom. How are you feeling now that you're home? I'm tired, but it's good to be in my own space again. Mom, I've been thinking about everything that's happened, and I want you to know that I'm going to do better. I want to be more involved in your recovery. What does that mean, Sarah? It means I'm going to call you every day to check on how you're feeling. It means I'm going to drive down next weekend to help you with grocery shopping and meal preparation. It means I'm going to listen when you tell me about your health instead of assuming you're being dramatic. I felt tears gathering in my eyes. That would mean a lot to me, sweetheart. And Mom, I'm sorry about the medical bills scaring the twins, but I'm also grateful for them because they helped me understand how serious your surgery really was. I think I needed that wake-up call. After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my living room, thinking about forgiveness and consequences, about the difference between punishment and education. I'd sent those medical bills not to hurt my children, but to help them understand something they'd been unable to see. The real test of whether they'd learned anything would come in the weeks and months ahead, as I navigated the long process of cardiac recovery. Would they step up to support me when the cameras weren't rolling and the drama had faded into routine medical appointments and lifestyle changes? Only time would tell. But for the first time in months, I felt hopeful that my children might finally understand the difference between caring about someone and actually taking care of them. And maybe, just maybe, they'd learn that lesson before it was too late to matter. The Cardiac Rehabilitation Center smelled like disinfectant and determination. 3 weeks into my recovery, I was attending twice-weekly sessions where I walked slowly on treadmills alongside other heart surgery survivors, all of us learning to trust our repaired hearts again. It was during one of these sessions that I received a phone call that would change everything I thought I knew about my children's recent behavior. The call came from my bank, First National, where I'd maintained accounts for over 30 years. Margaret Torres, the branch manager who had helped me refinance my house after Robert's death, sounded unusually formal when she asked if I could come in to discuss some irregularities with my accounts. What kind of irregularities? I asked, stepping away from the exercise bike, where I'd been pedaling at the pace of a leisurely stroll. Mrs. Williams, I'd prefer to discuss this in person. Would tomorrow morning be convenient? Say around 10 o'clock? The tone in her voice sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the rehabilitation center. Margaret, you're scaring me. Is my money safe? Your funds are secure, Mrs. Williams, but there are some transactions we need to review together. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through possibilities. Had someone stolen my identity while I was in the hospital? Had there been some kind of banking error? The surgery had left me feeling vulnerable in ways I was still discovering. and the thought of financial problems on top of my health crisis felt overwhelming. The next morning, I dressed carefully in my best navy blue suit, the one I'd worn to Robert's funeral 8 years earlier. Something about the formality of Margaret's call made me feel like I needed armor for whatever conversation was coming. Margaret's office overlooked the main banking floor, where I'd opened my first savings account as a young mother trying to build security for my family. She greeted me with a worried expression and gestured toward the chairs across from her desk. "Patricia, I need to show you something that concerns me." She opened a thick folder and spread several documents across her desk. "These are records of account inquiries that have been made about your finances over the past 6 months." I leaned forward to examine the papers, recognizing my account numbers but not understanding the significance of what I was seeing. Account inquiries from whom? That's what concerns me. These inquiries were made by someone claiming to be your power of attorney, asking about your account balances, your investment portfolios, and your automatic bill payments. My stomach dropped. I'd never granted anyone power of attorney over my finances. "Margaret, I don't have a power of attorney. Who made these inquiries?" She pointed to a name on one of the forms, and I felt the room spin around me. The name listed was David Williams, my youngest son, along with his law firm's letterhead. "Your son presented documents claiming you'd granted him financial power of attorney due to concerns about your mental capacity following your heart surgery. He said the family was worried about your ability to manage your finances during your recovery." I gripped the arms of the chair, feeling like I might faint. "Margaret, I never signed any such documents. I've been managing my own finances perfectly well." "I know, which is why I called you directly instead of providing the information he requested. Something about the situation didn't feel right, especially since you'd never mentioned any cognitive concerns during our previous conversations." Margaret pulled out another set of documents. "There's more, Patricia. Your son also inquired about the process for declaring someone mentally incompetent for financial purposes. He asked specifically about what kind of medical documentation would be required." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. While I'd been recovering from surgery, David had been researching ways to take control of my finances by having me declared mentally incompetent. The son I'd sacrificed everything for, the boy I'd worked double shifts to put through law school, had been plotting to steal my independence while I was at my most vulnerable. "Did he provide any medical documentation?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "He claimed to have documentation from your cardiologist, stating that heart surgery patients often experience cognitive decline, but when I asked to see the actual medical records, he said he was still obtaining them." I thought about Dr. Santos, who had been nothing but encouraging about my mental sharpness throughout my recovery. She'd specifically commented on how well I was retaining information about my medications and following complex post-surgical instructions. "Margaret, I need copies of everything. Every inquiry, every document he presented, every conversation you had with him." She nodded grimly. "I've already prepared a complete file for you." "Patricia, as someone who's known you for years, I have to ask, are you experiencing any confusion or memory problems that might have prompted your family's concern?" "No confusion, no memory problems. What I'm experiencing is crystal clarity about who my children really are." As I drove home from the bank, my mind reeled with the implications of what I'd discovered. The medical bills I'd sent to my children weren't just about teaching them a lesson about dismissing my health concerns. They'd apparently triggered something much more sinister. David had seen my medical crisis not as an opportunity to support his mother, but as an opportunity to gain control of her assets. I called Jonathan Mills from my car, explaining what I'd learned at the bank. His reaction was immediate and serious. "Patricia, what David attempted could constitute elder abuse and fraud. Presenting false documents to claim power of attorney is a serious crime, especially for a practicing attorney. What should I do?" "First, we need to document everything. I want you to come to my office this afternoon so we can review all the bank records and discuss your options. Second, I think you should consider hiring a private investigator to find out exactly what your children have been planning." The private investigator Jonathan recommended was a woman named Carmen Rodriguez, a former police detective who specialized in financial crimes and elder abuse cases. Carmen had short gray hair, sharp eyes, and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that made me trust her immediately. "Mrs. Williams, I need you to understand that what I might discover could be very painful," Carmen said as we sat in Jonathan's conference room that afternoon. "Family financial exploitation often involves long-term planning and multiple family members. I need to know the truth no matter how painful it is. All right, I'll need access to your phone records, email accounts, and any other communications you've had with your children over the past year. I'll also need to run background checks on their financial situations." Over the next week, while I continued my cardiac rehabilitation and tried to process David's betrayal, Carmen worked quietly behind the scenes. She called me the following Friday with a request to meet in person. "I have information that you need to hear, but it's not something I want to discuss over the phone," she said. We met at a quiet coffee shop downtown, away from my neighborhood where people might recognize me. Carmen arrived with a thick folder, an expression that told me I wasn't going to like what she'd discovered. "Mrs. Williams, I found evidence of a coordinated effort by all 3 of your children to gain access to your finances," she began without preamble. "This goes back much further than your recent surgery." She opened the folder and showed me printouts of email conversations between Michael, Sarah, and David, dating back almost 2 years. The subject lines alone made my stomach churn. Mom's financial situation, inheritance planning, concerns about mom's spending. "They've been discussing your finances for years?" I asked, scanning the emails. "Not just discussing, planning. Look at this email from Sarah to her brothers, dated 14 months ago." I read the email with growing horror. Sarah had written, "I'm worried that Mom is going to spend all of Dad's insurance money on unnecessary things." She mentioned wanting to remodel the kitchen, and she's been taking those expensive art classes. "We need to start thinking about how to protect our inheritance before she squanders it all." Carmen showed me Michael's response. "I agree. Mom's always been impulsive with money. 'Member how she insisted on putting David through law school even when we couldn't afford it? She doesn't think long-term about financial security." But it was David's response that cut the deepest. "Maybe it's time we started having serious conversations about Mom's capacity to manage her finances responsibly. As her health declines, we might need to consider more direct intervention." "They were planning this before I even got sick," I whispered. "It gets worse," Carmen said gently. "After your heart surgery was scheduled, the emails became much more specific. David researched the process for obtaining emergency power of attorney, and Sarah began documenting what she called your concerning behaviors. She showed me a detailed list Sarah had compiled, including entries like, Mom forgot where she put her reading glasses and spent 20 minutes looking for them. Mom seemed confused about what day her doctor's appointment was scheduled, and Mom asked me to repeat something I'd said because she didn't hear me clearly. These are completely normal behaviors, I said, feeling sick. Everyone misplaces their glasses sometimes. Of course they are. But Sarah was building a case for cognitive decline. She was planning to present this list to support David's power of attorney petition. Carmen pulled out another set of documents. Meanwhile, Michael was researching your property value and your investment accounts. He'd obtained your social security number and was making inquiries about your assets with various financial institutions. The scope of their betrayal was breathtaking. While I'd been worried about my health and feeling dismissed by their lack of support, my 3 children had been systematically planning to take control of my finances. There's one more thing, Carmen said hesitantly. I found evidence that they'd already started making plans for what to do with your house. She showed me real estate listings that Michael had saved, all for homes in assisted living communities. The emails revealed that they'd toured several facilities, looking for what Sarah called somewhere appropriate for Mom when the time comes. When the time comes for what? According to their emails, when you could no longer live independently. They'd already selected a facility and were planning to sell your house to pay for your care there. I stared at the real estate listings for sterile senior living apartments, each one a far cry from the home where I'd raised my children and built a life with Robert. They'd been planning to warehouse me in institutional care while they divided up the proceeds from selling my home. Mrs. Williams, I need to tell you something else. The facility they selected has a waiting list, and according to my research, David put down a deposit to hold a spot for you. The coffee shop around us seemed to fade away as the full magnitude of my children's betrayal sank in. They hadn't just been dismissive of my health concerns, they'd been actively planning to use my medical crisis as justification for taking over my life completely. How long have they been planning this? Based on the emails, they started seriously planning about 6 months ago, right around the time you first mentioned having chest pains. I realized with stunning clarity that my children's dismissal of my health concerns hadn't been about being too busy or too stressed to listen. They'd been waiting for me to develop serious health problems that they could use to justify taking control of my finances and my living situation. Carmen, I need you to document everything. Every email, every financial inquiry, every plan they've made. I want a complete record of what they've been doing. That night, I sat in my living room with whiskers on my lap, staring at the walls of the home my children had been planning to sell without my knowledge. Every piece of furniture, every photograph, every memory-soaked corner of the house they'd been preparing to liquidate for their own benefit. My phone rang, and I saw Sarah's number on the screen. For the first time since my surgery, I felt genuine anger rather than hurt when I heard her voice. "Hi, Mom. How are you feeling today? Did you make it to your cardiac rehab appointment?" The caring tone in her voice, which I'd been so grateful to hear over the past few weeks, now sounded completely different. I wondered if she was asking about my recovery, so she could document any signs of confusion or weakness. "I'm feeling much better, thank you." "Sarah, I have a question for you." "Of course, what is it?" "Have you been keeping notes about my behavior since my surgery?" The silence on the other end of the phone lasted so long I thought the call had been dropped. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice tight with what might have been panic. "What do you mean, notes?" "I mean detailed documentation of times when I've seemed confused or forgetful. Lists of what you might call concerning behaviors." "Mom, why would you ask that?" "Of course I haven't been keeping notes about you." The lie came so easily that I wondered how many other lies she'd told me over the years. "Sarah, I need you to listen carefully. I know about the emails. I know about David's attempts to get power of attorney. I know about the assisted living facility you've all been touring." The sharp intake of breath on the other end of the phone told me everything I needed to know. "Mom, I can explain. We were just trying to plan ahead, to make sure you'd be taken care of if your health got worse. By documenting my normal behaviors as signs of cognitive decline? By planning to sell my house without telling me? By researching ways to have me declared mentally incompetent? It wasn't like that. We were just being responsible, thinking about worst-case scenarios." "No, Sarah. Responsible would have been supporting me through my surgery and recovery. What you were doing was plotting to steal my independence while I was at my most vulnerable." I could hear her crying on the other end of the phone, but for the first time in my life, my daughter's tears didn't move me to comfort her. "Mom, please don't be angry. We love you, and we were just scared about what would happen if you couldn't take care of yourself anymore. If you loved me, you would have talked to me about your concerns instead of conspiring behind my back. If you were scared, you would have offered to help me rather than planning to control me." After I hung up, my phone immediately rang again. This time it was Michael, his voice strained with barely controlled panic. "Mom?" Sarah called me crying. She said, "You know about some emails?" "I think there's been a misunderstanding about our intentions." "Michael, there's no misunderstanding. I have copies of everything. Every email, every plan, every lie you've told." "Mom, please let me explain. We weren't trying to hurt you, we were trying to protect you." "Protect me from what?" "From making my own decisions. From living in my own home. From managing my own money. From being taken advantage of by people who might try to exploit your vulnerability after surgery." The irony was so thick I almost laughed. "Michael, the only people who tried to exploit my vulnerability after surgery were my own children." "That's not fair, Mom. We were genuinely concerned about your well-being." "No, you are concerned about your inheritance. There's a difference." Michael's voice became more desperate. "Mom, whatever Sarah told you about those emails, you have to understand the context. We were just discussing hypothetical situations, trying to be prepared for anything that might happen. There was nothing hypothetical about David putting down a deposit at an assisted living facility or about the list of my concerning behaviors that Sarah compiled." The silence that followed told me that Michael hadn't realized how much I'd discovered. "Mom, I think we need to sit down and talk about this as a family." "I think we do too, Michael. In fact, I think it's time for all three of you to understand exactly what the consequences are for planning to steal your mother's independence." David called within an hour of my conversation with Michael. Unlike his siblings, he didn't try to deny or minimize what they'd been planning. Instead, he went straight into legal damage control mode. Mom, I need you to understand that everything we discussed in those emails was purely theoretical. We never actually took any legal action to obtain power of attorney or to have you declared incompetent. You tried to obtain my financial information by falsely claiming to be my power of attorney. That was just an inquiry to understand what protections were in place for your accounts. I was acting out of concern for your security. Even now, caught red-handed in his deception, David was trying to spin his attempted financial exploitation as concern for my well-being. David, do you remember what you told me when I called you about my surgery? Mom, I think we're getting off track here. The important thing is that no actual legal documents were filed. No actual harm was done. You told me I was being dramatic. You said you couldn't afford any distractions from work. You suggested I see a therapist about my hypochondria. I remember being stressed about work, yes. You were dismissing my legitimate health crisis, while simultaneously planning to use that same health crisis to justify taking control of my finances. For the first time since the conversation began, David was silent. David, you're an attorney. You understand the legal implications of what you attempted. You also understand that I now have grounds to file elder abuse charges against all three of you. Mom, please don't threaten legal action against your own children. I'm not threatening anything. I'm explaining the options available to me now that I know what my children were planning. What do you want from us? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with fear and desperation. What did I want from the children who had planned to steal my independence while pretending to be too busy to support me through a health crisis? I want you to understand that actions have consequences, David. And I want you to live with those consequences. The next morning, I called Jonathan Mills and instructed him to proceed with additional changes to my will and estate planning. The original changes I'd made before surgery had been about teaching my children a lesson about dismissing my health concerns. These new changes were about protecting myself from their continued attempts to control my life. Patricia, are you certain about these modifications? Jonathan asked as he reviewed the documents I'd requested. Jonathan, my children have spent months planning to have me declared mentally incompetent so they could steal my independence and my assets. They've researched assisted living facilities and made financial inquiries under false pretenses. I think protecting myself from them is not just reasonable but necessary. The new will included provisions that would prevent any of my children from challenging my mental competency after my death. It also established a trust structure that would make it impossible for them to gain control of my assets, even if they somehow succeeded in having me declared incompetent in the future. I'm also adding a provision that if any of them attempts to have me declared mentally incompetent or tries to obtain power of attorney without my explicit written consent, they will be completely disinherited. Jonathan nodded approvingly. That's a wise precaution given what they've already attempted. Carmen Rodriguez arrived that afternoon with her final report, a comprehensive documentation of everything my children had planned and attempted over the past year. Mrs. Williams, I have enough evidence here to support criminal charges for attempted financial elder abuse, she said, setting a thick folder on my kitchen table. The question is whether you want to pursue those charges. I thought about David's career, about the professional consequences he would face if criminal charges were filed against him. I thought about Sarah's marriage, and how financial crimes charges might affect her custody of my grandchildren. I thought about Michael's business and the impact that legal troubles might have on his family's security. Carmen, I don't want to destroy their lives. I just want them to understand that their behavior has consequences. Then I suggest you use this documentation as leverage. Make it clear that you have evidence of their attempted exploitation, and that any future attempts to control your finances or living situation will result in criminal charges. That evening, I composed a group email to all three of my children. It was time for them to understand exactly what I knew and what the consequences would be for their betrayal. Michael, Sarah, and David, I began. I am writing to inform you that I have obtained complete documentation of your plans to gain control of my finances and living situation. I have copies of all your emails discussing my inheritance, your research into power of attorney procedures, your inquiries into my financial accounts, and your selection of an assisted living facility where you plan to place me. I paused in my typing, thinking about the months they'd spent plotting while I worried about my health and felt dismissed by their lack of support. I now understand that your dismissal of my health concerns was not about being too busy or too stressed to listen. You were waiting for me to develop serious health problems that you could use to justify taking control of my life. I attached copies of some of the most damning emails and bank inquiry records. I want you to know that I have legal grounds to file elder abuse charges against all of you. I have chosen not to pursue criminal charges at this time, but that decision is conditional on your future behavior. I outlined the new provisions in my will and the protective measures I'd put in place to prevent them from gaining control of my assets or living situation. The medical bills I sent to your homes were meant to help you understand the cost of dismissing someone's health concerns. Now I want you to understand the cost of planning to exploit someone's vulnerability. I concluded the email with a simple statement. Your actions have consequences. Learn to live with them. Within an hour of sending the email, my phone was ringing constantly. I ignored the calls from all 3 of my children, and instead sat in my garden, watching the sunset and feeling something I hadn't experienced in months: complete peace. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt truly secure, not because my children had learned to value me, but because I had learned to protect myself from their lack of value for me. The real reckoning was still to come, but I was no longer afraid of it. My children had shown me exactly who they were, and I had responded by showing them exactly who I could be when pushed too far. The war was far from over, but for the first time I was confident about who would win. 6 months had passed since I'd sent that final email to my children, and the silence from their end had been deafening. No more guilt-laden phone calls. No more surprise visits filled with false concern. No more attempts to insert themselves into my medical care or recovery process. For the first time in years, I was living my life entirely on my own terms, and the freedom was intoxicating. My cardiac rehabilitation had progressed better than anyone expected. Dr. Santos was amazed by my recovery, commenting that patients with strong support systems usually fared well. But I seemed to be thriving, despite having minimal family involvement. What she didn't understand was that the absence of my children's toxic influence had actually accelerated my healing. I joined a book club at the local library, started taking watercolor painting classes, and even began volunteering at the animal shelter where I'd adopted Whiskers years ago. My days were full of activities I genuinely enjoyed, surrounded by people who valued my company, rather than seeing me as an obstacle to their inheritance. It was during one of these peaceful Tuesday afternoons, as I was painting in my sunroom while Whiskers napped in a patch of sunlight, that my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see a woman I didn't recognize standing on my porch with what appeared to be legal documents in her hand. "Mrs. Williams? I'm Jennifer Klein from Family Services. I need to speak with you about a matter concerning your welfare." My heart rate spiked, but I'd learned to trust my instincts about people, and something about this woman's demeanor immediately put me on guard. I opened the door but kept the security chain in place. "What kind of matter?" "Mrs. Williams, we've received reports from concerned family members indicating that you may be experiencing cognitive decline and could be at risk of financial exploitation. I need to conduct a welfare check." The words hit me like ice water. Despite all my protective measures, despite the legal documentation I'd put in place, my children had found another way to try to gain control over my life. Who filed these reports? I'm not at liberty to discuss the specific individuals, but multiple family members have expressed concerns about your ability to manage your affairs independently. I could see through the crack in the door that Jennifer Klein was young, probably in her 20s, with the earnest expression of someone who genuinely believed she was helping vulnerable people. She had no idea she was being used as a weapon in my children's ongoing war against my independence. "Ms. Klein, I appreciate your concern, but I can assure you that I'm managing my affairs perfectly well. If you'd like, I can provide you with documentation from my physician confirming my mental capacity." "Mrs. Williams, I really do need to come inside and conduct a proper assessment. The reports we received were quite detailed and concerning." "What kind of details?" She consulted her clipboard. "Reports of confusion about medications, difficulty managing financial responsibilities, signs of paranoid thinking, and concerns about your living conditions. Every single item on her list was a lie, carefully crafted to sound legitimate to someone who didn't know me. I thought about Sarah's list of my concerning behaviors and realized my children had simply expanded their documentation to include more serious allegations. Miss Klein, before I allow you into my home, I need to call my attorney. Mrs. Williams, if you're truly managing well independently, you shouldn't need an attorney present for a simple welfare check. Her response confirmed my suspicions. Someone had coached her to interpret any request for legal representation as a sign of cognitive problems or guilty conscience. Ms. Klein, I'm a 67-year-old woman who has managed my own affairs successfully for decades. My request for legal counsel isn't a sign of confusion. It's a sign of wisdom. I closed the door and immediately called Jonathan Mills, explaining the situation. His response was swift and angry. Patricia, this is exactly the kind of harassment I was afraid they might attempt. Don't allow anyone into your home without proper documentation and legal representation present. Within an hour, Jonathan arrived at my house along with Carmen Rodriguez, who I'd kept on retainer specifically for situations like this. Jennifer Klein was still on my porch, now accompanied by a supervisor and what appeared to be a police officer. Ms. Klein, Jonathan announced, presenting his business card, I'm Mrs. Williams' attorney. Before any assessment takes place, I need to review the specific allegations that prompted this investigation. The supervisor, an older woman named Margaret Foster, seemed more experienced and immediately recognized that the situation was more complex than a routine welfare check. Mr. Mills, we've received multiple reports over the past several weeks from Mrs. Williams' adult children expressing concerns about her welfare. The reports include allegations of financial confusion, medication management problems, and paranoid behavior. Carmen stepped forward. Ms. Foster, I'm a private investigator working with Mrs. Williams. I have documentation that these same adult children have been attempting to fraudulently gain control of Mrs. Williams' finances for over a year. These reports may be part of a coordinated effort to harass an elderly woman. I watched Margaret Foster's expression change as she began to understand that she might have walked into a family conflict rather than a legitimate elder abuse situation. Mrs. Williams, would you be willing to participate in a voluntary assessment to demonstrate your capacity? It might help resolve these concerns quickly. Jonathan nodded his approval and I agreed. Over the next 2 hours, I underwent a comprehensive evaluation that included cognitive testing, a review of my medical records, an assessment of my living conditions, and a detailed interview about my daily activities and financial management. The results were unambiguous. Not only was I functioning independently at a high level, but my cognitive abilities were well above average for someone my age. My home was immaculately maintained, my medications were properly organized, and my financial records were meticulously kept. Mrs. Williams, Jennifer Klein said as she finished her report, I owe you an apology. It's clear that the reports we received were inaccurate. You're obviously managing very well independently. Margaret Foster was more direct. Mrs. Williams, I'm going to be frank with you. In my 20 years of doing this work, I've learned to recognize when family members use our services to harass elderly relatives they're in conflict with. I believe that's what happened here. What does that mean for my children? It means that filing false reports with family services is a misdemeanor offense. It also means that any future reports from the same sources will be viewed with extreme skepticism. After the social workers left, I sat with Jonathan and Carmen in my living room, feeling a mixture of relief and rage. They're escalating, Carmen observed. When the power of attorney attempt failed, they moved to trying to use government services to achieve the same goal. What's our next move? I asked. Jonathan leaned forward, his expression serious. Patricia, I think it's time to consider the nuclear option. We have enough evidence now to pursue criminal charges for elder abuse, harassment, and filing false reports. We can also pursue civil remedies, including restraining orders. I thought about my grandchildren, about Emma and Jake, who I barely knew because their parents had kept them away from me. I thought about Michael's children in Portland, about Sarah's twins in Denver. Did I really want to destroy their parents' lives, even after everything those parents had done to me? Before we go that route, I want to try one more approach. That evening, I composed what I knew would be my final communication with my children. This time, instead of sending an email, I wrote individual letters and had them delivered by certified mail to ensure there would be legal documentation of their receipt. Michael's letter was the longest, because he was the oldest and because I'd had the highest expectations for him. Michael, I wrote, you are 42 years old, successful in your career, and a father to 2 beautiful children. When did you decide that your 67-year-old mother was your enemy? I detailed every attempt they'd made to control my life, from the financial inquiries to the false social services reports. I gave you life, raised you with love, and supported your dreams even when it meant sacrifice for myself. In return, you spent the past year trying to steal my independence and dignity. The letter to Sarah was more pointed. Sarah, you documented my normal behaviors as signs of cognitive decline. You researched assisted living facilities, where you planned to warehouse me. You lied to social workers about my capacity to live independently. You've shown me exactly what kind of person you are when you think there's money at stake. David's letter was the shortest and most direct. David, you're an attorney. You know the legal implications of everything you've attempted. You also know that I have enough evidence to destroy your career and possibly send you to prison. The only reason I haven't pursued criminal charges is because I still remember the little boy who used to crawl into my lap when he was scared. Each letter concluded with the same ultimatum. You have one final opportunity to acknowledge your behavior and make genuine amends. If you choose not to take that opportunity, or if you make any further attempts to interfere with my independence, I will pursue every legal remedy available to me. I gave them 2 weeks to respond. Michael was the first to call, just 3 days after receiving his letter. His voice was different than I'd heard it in years, stripped of the arrogance and dismissiveness that had characterized our recent conversations. Mom, I got your letter and I need to see you in person. Can I fly out this weekend? That depends, Michael. Are you coming to apologize or to try to convince me that your behavior was justified? I'm coming to apologize. I'm coming to try to understand how I became the kind of person who would treat his mother the way I've treated you. When Michael arrived on Saturday morning, he looked like he'd aged 5 years in the past 6 months. His hair was grayer, his face was drawn, and he carried himself with the posture of a man who'd been forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about himself. We sat in my living room, the same room where he'd played with toys as a child, where he'd done homework as a teenager, where he'd announced his engagement and shared news of his children's births. Now it felt like a courtroom where he'd come to face judgment. Mom, I've been seeing a therapist since I got your email 6 months ago. He began. I needed help understanding how I'd become so focused on your money that I'd lost sight of your humanity. It was the first time any of my children had acknowledged that their behavior had been about money rather than concern for my welfare. What did you learn in therapy, Michael? I learned that I'd been living in fear for years. Fear that you'd spend all of Dad's insurance money, fear that there wouldn't be anything left for us, fear that I wouldn't be able to provide for my own family the way you and Dad provided for us. He paused, tears gathering in his eyes. But mostly I learned that I'd convinced myself that you were the problem, that your independence was a threat to my security, instead of recognizing that my greed was a threat to our relationship. And the false social services report? Michael looked genuinely confused. Mom, I didn't file any report with social services. I swear to you, I had nothing to do with that. I studied his face, using all the skills I'd developed over decades of reading my children's expressions when they claimed innocence. Michael was telling the truth. If you didn't file the report, who did? I think it was David. He called me and Sarah about 3 weeks ago, saying he'd found a way to force you to accept help whether you wanted it or not. When we asked what he meant, he said he couldn't discuss details because of attorney-client privilege, but that he was handling the situation. The revelation that David had acted alone in filing the false report somehow made his betrayal feel even worse. At least when I'd thought all 3 of them were coordinating their attacks, there was a kind of logic to their behavior. The idea that David had escalated to involving government services without even telling his siblings suggested a level of desperation and ruthlessness I hadn't expected. Michael, I need you to understand something. Your fear about your inheritance was completely unfounded. I've never been irresponsible with money, and I've never had any intention of spending your father's insurance money frivolously. I know that now. The therapist helped me realize that my fears weren't based on anything you'd actually done. They were based on my own insecurities about money and my sense of entitlement to wealth I hadn't earned. We talked for 3 hours, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was speaking with my actual son rather than a stranger wearing his face. Michael had done something none of my children had managed before. He'd taken genuine responsibility for his behavior without trying to justify it or minimize its impact. Mom, I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm hoping you'll give me a chance to rebuild our relationship. I want to earn back your trust, not through grand gestures, but through consistent, respectful behavior over time. What about Sarah and David? Michael's expression darkened. Sarah is still convinced that she was acting out of love and concern for you. She's angry that you've turned the family against each other by refusing to accept our help. I don't think she's capable of seeing her behavior clearly. And David? David is in full legal defense mode. He's convinced that you're going to file criminal charges against him, and he's preparing to fight rather than apologize. He's hired his own attorney and is claiming that everything he did was legally justified. The conversation with Michael gave me hope that at least one of my children might be salvageable, but it also confirmed my worst fears about the other two. Sarah called the next day, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. Mom, I heard that Michael visited you. I hope he didn't fill your head with more paranoid ideas about your family. Sarah, Michael came to apologize for his behavior and to take responsibility for the pain he's caused me. Apologize for what? For caring about your welfare? For trying to make sure you're safe and secure? Even now, even after everything that had been exposed, Sarah was still framing their attempted financial exploitation as concern for my well-being. Sarah, you documented normal behaviors as signs of cognitive decline. You researched assisted living facilities without my knowledge. You planned to sell my house and control my finances. That's not caring, that's plotting. Mom, you're paranoid. You're seeing conspiracies where there are none. We were just trying to be prepared for the possibility that you might need help someday. The gaslighting was so blatant it was almost impressive. Sarah was telling me that my accurate understanding of their documented plans was paranoia. Sarah, I have copies of your emails. I have records of your financial inquiries. I have documentation of every plan you made. These aren't delusions or paranoid fantasies. These are facts. Those emails were taken out of context. You're interpreting normal family discussions as something sinister. There's nothing normal about adult children plotting to take control of their mother's finances and living situation without her knowledge or consent. Mom, I think you need help. I think the stress of your surgery has affected your thinking. And I think you're being influenced by people who don't have your best interests at heart. The conversation ended with Sarah hanging up on me, but not before she delivered one final threat. Mom, if you don't stop this vendetta against your own family, you're going to lose all of us permanently. The threat didn't have the impact she'd intended. The idea of losing children who saw me as an obstacle to their inheritance rather than a person deserving of love and respect didn't frighten me. It felt like liberation. David never called at all. Instead, I received a formal letter from his attorney 3 days before my 2-week deadline expired. The letter was a masterpiece of legal doublespeak that essentially argued that David had done nothing wrong and that any attempt to pursue legal action against him would be met with vigorous resistance. The letter claimed that David's inquiries about power of attorney were reasonable precautionary measures taken out of legitimate concern for his mother's welfare. It characterized the false social services report as a, quote, good faith effort to ensure proper evaluation of an elderly person's living situation. Most insultingly, the letter suggested that my anger about David's behavior was itself evidence of cognitive decline and poor judgment that supported the need for family intervention in my affairs. The letter concluded with a barely veiled threat. Mr. Williams is prepared to defend himself against any frivolous legal action and will seek all available remedies including damages for harassment and defamation if his mother continues her baseless attacks on his character and professional reputation. I showed the letter to Jonathan Mills, who read it with growing amazement. Patricia, this letter is essentially an admission of guilt wrapped in legal threats. David is confirming that he made the power of attorney inquiries and filed the social services report, while simultaneously arguing that these actions were justified. What does this mean for our case against him? It means we have everything we need to pursue criminal charges. The question is whether you want to destroy your son's legal career. I spent a sleepless night thinking about David, about the little boy who'd cried when he accidentally stepped on an ant, who'd made me Mother's Day cards decorated with crayon hearts, who'd called me his hero when he graduated from law school. Somewhere along the way, that sensitive child had become a man capable of trying to have his own mother declared mentally incompetent for financial gain. The next morning, I made my decision. I called the police and filed a formal complaint against David for filing false reports with Family Services. I authorized Jonathan to pursue civil charges for attempted financial elder abuse. And I instructed Carmen to prepare a comprehensive report documenting all of David's actions for submission to the State Bar Association. Within a week, David was facing professional ethics charges that could result in the suspension or revocation of his law license. The criminal charges for filing false reports carried potential jail time and mandatory community service. The civil case could result in significant financial penalties and a permanent restraining order. But the most devastating consequence for David wasn't legal. It was professional. Word spread quickly through the legal community about an attorney who'd tried to have his own mother declared mentally incompetent for financial gain. Law firms began distancing themselves from him. Clients started asking for different representation, and his promising partnership track was quietly derailed. Sarah's response to David's legal troubles was to blame me for destroying the family by refusing to forgive and forget. She sent me a series of increasingly angry text messages accusing me of being vindictive and cruel. "You're ruining David's life over a misunderstanding." Read one message. "You're turning your own children into enemies because you can't accept that you need help." Read another. The final message was the most revealing. "We tried to help you, and this is how you repay us. Don't expect us to be there for you when you really do need family support." The threat to withdraw their support would have terrified me a year ago. Now it just confirmed that I'd made the right decision in protecting myself from people who saw my vulnerability as an opportunity for exploitation. Michael continued to visit regularly, slowly rebuilding our relationship through consistent, respectful behavior. He brought his children to see me for the first time in years, and I watched Emma and Jake rediscover the grandmother their mother had tried to keep them away from. "Mom, I need you to know that I support your decision about David," Michael told me during one of these visits. "What he did was unforgivable, and he needs to face consequences for his actions. Are you worried about Sarah cutting you off? Sarah can do whatever she wants. I'm not going to let her guilt me into defending behavior I know was wrong." The resolution of the legal cases took almost a year. David ultimately pled guilty to filing false reports in exchange for avoiding jail time. But he received 2 years of probation and had to complete 200 hours of community service at an elder care facility. The Bar Association suspended his license for 18 months, effectively ending his partnership prospects and forcing him to rebuild his career from scratch. The civil case resulted in a substantial financial settlement that I donated entirely to elder abuse prevention programs. I didn't want David's money. I wanted him to understand that actions have consequences. Sarah eventually stopped trying to contact me altogether. According to Michael, she'd convinced herself that I was suffering from some kind of mental illness that made me paranoid and vindictive. It was easier for her to believe that I was sick than to acknowledge that her behavior had been unethical. On the second anniversary of my heart surgery, I hosted a dinner party for the friends I'd made in my book club, my painting class, and my volunteer work at the animal shelter. My house was filled with laughter, good food, and people who valued my company for its own sake rather than seeing me as a means to an end. Michael came to the party with his children, and we all raised a toast to my recovery. As I looked around my dining room table at the faces of people who genuinely cared about my well-being, I realized that I'd gained something precious in the process of losing my toxic children. I'd gained my freedom. The medical bills that had started this whole confrontation were long since paid, covered by my insurance and my own financial resources. The real cost of my health crisis hadn't been measured in dollars. It had been measured in the revelation of my children's true character and the price of protecting myself from their exploitation. Some people might see my story as tragic, the tale of a mother who lost her family through unforgiving pursuit of justice. But I see it differently. I see it as the story of a woman who learned to value herself enough to demand that others value her too. My children had wanted me to be weak, confused, and dependent so they could control my life and my assets. Instead, I became strong, clear-minded, and fiercely independent. They'd wanted to diminish me, but their betrayal had actually empowered me. The heart surgery had saved my life, but standing up to my children had given me my life back. As I sat in my garden that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete peace. Whiskers purred on my lap, my flowers bloomed around me, and my house stood solid and secure behind me. I was alone, but I wasn't lonely. I was free, and that freedom was worth more than any inheritance I might have left behind. My phone rang, interrupting my peaceful reflection. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway. "Mrs. Williams? This is Dr. Rebecca Chen from Pacific University. I'm researching elder abuse and family financial exploitation, and I was wondering if you'd be willing to share your story to help other families recognize and prevent these situations." I smiled, thinking about all the other elderly people who might be facing similar betrayals from their own children. People who might not have the resources or knowledge to protect themselves the way I had. "Dr. Chen, I'd be honored to help. When would you like to meet?" As I hung up the phone, I realized that my story wasn't ending. It was transforming into something larger, something that might help protect other people from the kind of betrayal I'd experienced. My children had thought they were too busy for my drama. Now my drama was going to be too big for them to ignore, and too important for the world to forget. 3 years after Dr. Rebecca Chen first contacted me about sharing my story, I stood before an audience of 200 social workers, attorneys, and family counselors at the National Conference on Elder Abuse Prevention. The auditorium was packed, and I could see people taking notes as I recounted the tactics my children had used to try to gain control of my life. "The most insidious aspect of family financial exploitation," I explained to the attentive crowd, "is that it's often disguised as concern. My children didn't present themselves as greedy opportunists. They presented themselves as loving family members worried about my welfare." After my presentation, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes. She was probably in her 50s, well-dressed but carrying herself with the weight of someone dealing with a crisis. "Mrs. Williams, my name is Linda Martinez. Everything you described is happening to my mother right now. My brother has been documenting her, concerning behaviors, and talking about the need for intervention. I thought I was being paranoid, but listening to your story, I realize he's following the exact same playbook your children used." I spent an hour with Linda, sharing the warning signs I'd learned to recognize, and connecting her with Carmen Rodriguez, who had expanded her practice to focus specifically on preventing family financial exploitation. By the end of our conversation, Linda had a clear plan for protecting her mother and documenting her brother's attempted manipulation. "Mrs. Williams, you probably saved my mother's independence today," Linda said as we exchanged contact information. "I can't thank you enough." Conversations like this had become a regular part of my life since I'd started speaking publicly about my experience. I'd given presentations at senior centers, legal conferences, and medical symposiums. Each time, people approached me afterward with their own stories of family betrayal and exploitation. My house had become an unofficial headquarters for elder abuse prevention work. Carmen used my dining room table for client meetings when her office was booked. Jonathan stored legal precedents and case files in my spare bedroom. Dr. Chen conducted interviews with other survivors in my living room, where the comfortable furniture and familiar surroundings helped people feel safe enough to share their painful experiences. "Patricia, you've created something remarkable here," Dr. Chen told me one afternoon as we reviewed transcripts from her latest interviews. "Your house has become a sanctuary for people who've been betrayed by their families." "It feels good to use my experience for something positive," I replied, refilling her coffee cup. "For so long I felt like a victim. Now I feel like a warrior." The work wasn't always easy. Some of the stories I heard were far worse than my own experience. I met elderly people who'd been physically abused by family members, seeking to control their assets. I spoke with seniors who'd been isolated from friends and neighbors by children, who wanted to eliminate outside witnesses to their exploitation. I counseled people who'd lost their homes, their savings, and their dignity to family members they'd trusted completely. But I also witnessed remarkable recoveries. Linda Martinez's mother, Elena, became one of my closest friends after successfully defending herself against her son's attempted financial takeover. A man named Robert Thompson rebuilt his relationship with his daughter after she recognized and apologized for her exploitative behavior. An elderly couple, the Washingtons, managed to reconcile with their adult children after setting clear boundaries about financial independence. The key, I often told people, is understanding that family love doesn't automatically entitle anyone to control over your life or your assets. Real love respects your autonomy and dignity. My own family situation had stabilized into a new normal. Michael continued to visit regularly, and our relationship had grown stronger than it had been in years. He'd completed his own therapy work and had become an advocate for elder rights in his tech company, implementing policies to support employees dealing with aging parents. "Mom, I learned something important from watching you stand up to us," he told me during one of his visits. "I learned that real strength isn't about controlling other people. It's about controlling yourself and your own actions." Michael's children, Emma and Jake, now teenagers, had become regular fixtures in my life. They helped me tend my garden, assisted with my painting projects, and often brought friends over to hear stories about their remarkable grandmother, who'd fought off her own family's attempts to control her. "Grandma Nellie is legendary at our school," Emma told me proudly. "When kids complain about their parents being controlling, we tell them about you and how you fought back." The relationship had also taught Michael's children valuable lessons about family dynamics and personal autonomy. Jake had written a school essay about elder abuse that won a state competition and raised awareness among his classmates about the issue. Sarah remained completely estranged from me, and according to Michael, she'd constructed an elaborate narrative in which I was the villain who'd destroyed the family through paranoia and vindictiveness. She told her children that I was dangerous and unstable, effectively poisoning my relationship with my other grandchildren. "It's her loss," Michael said when I expressed sadness about not knowing Sarah's twins. "Jessica and Jordan are missing out on having an amazing grandmother because their mother can't admit she was wrong." David's legal career had eventually recovered somewhat, but he'd been forced to relocate to a different state and start over in a smaller firm. The ethics violations remained on his record, and his reputation in the legal community had been permanently damaged. He'd never attempted to contact me or apologize for his actions. "Some people learn from their mistakes," Carmen observed, "and others just learn to be more careful about getting caught." The elder abuse prevention work had introduced me to a whole community of people I never would have met otherwise. Dr. Chen had become a close friend, often joining me for dinner and sharing updates on her research. Carmen and I worked together so frequently that people sometimes mistook us for sisters. Jonathan had become like family, checking on me regularly and handling legal matters for other seniors pro bono. "Patricia, you've built a chosen family," my therapist Dr. Sarah Goldstein observed during one of our monthly sessions. I'd started therapy not because I was struggling, but because I wanted to process my experiences in a healthy way and avoid becoming bitter about my children's betrayal. "I think that's one of the most important things I learned from this whole experience," I replied. "Family isn't just about blood relationships. It's about people who show up for you consistently and treat you with respect and love." Dr. Goldstein nodded approvingly. "You've taken a traumatic experience and transformed it into something that helps other people. That's remarkable resilience." I had a choice. I could have become a bitter old woman consumed by anger at my children, or I could use what I learned to help other people avoid or escape similar situations. The second option felt much more empowering. My health continued to improve beyond what anyone had expected. Dr. Santos, my cardiologist, was amazed by my recovery and often cited my case as an example of how emotional well-being could impact physical healing. "Mrs. Williams, your heart function has improved to the point where you're healthier now than many people half your age," she told me during a recent checkup. "I believe your emotional healing has contributed significantly to your physical recovery. It turns out that eliminating toxic stress from your life is better medicine than anything you can prescribe, I replied with a smile. The house that my children had planned to sell and liquidate had become a hub of meaningful activity. My dining room hosted support group meetings for elder abuse survivors. My living room was used for legal consultations with seniors who couldn't afford attorneys. My kitchen was always full of people sharing meals and stories of resilience and recovery. Mrs. Williams, your home has become a healing space for so many people, observed Father Miguel Santos, a priest who'd started referring elderly parishioners to our support groups. You've turned your pain into purpose. Father, I think that's what we're supposed to do with our suffering. We're supposed to use it to help other people avoid or overcome similar pain. The financial security I'd fought so hard to protect had allowed me to be generous with others facing similar crises. I'd helped fund legal representation for seniors who couldn't afford attorneys to fight their exploitative family members. I'd provided temporary financial assistance to elderly people who'd been financially abused by their children. I'd even purchased a small building downtown that served as a community center for elder abuse prevention programs. You know, Mrs. Williams, Jonathan told me as we toured the new community center, your children's greed has inadvertently funded one of the most effective elder abuse prevention programs in the state. There's some poetic justice in that, I agreed. They wanted my money for themselves, and instead it's being used to protect other people from family members just like them. The community center offered legal consultations, financial planning assistance, counseling services, and educational programs. We'd helped hundreds of elderly people protect themselves from family exploitation and abuse. The success stories poured in regularly. Mrs. Patterson, an 80-year-old woman whose son had been stealing her Social Security checks, successfully prosecuted him and recovered most of her stolen money. Mr. Reeves, a widower whose daughter had been pressuring him to sign over his house, learned to set boundaries and maintain his independence. The Nakamura family had reconciled after their adult children recognized and apologized for their financially abusive behavior. Every person we help makes this whole experience worthwhile, I told Carmen as we reviewed the latest statistics on our success rates. Patricia, you've probably prevented millions of dollars in elder abuse and protected hundreds of families from the kind of trauma you experienced. The speaking engagements had also expanded beyond elder abuse prevention. I'd been invited to talk about resilience, about standing up to family manipulation, about the importance of maintaining dignity in the face of betrayal. Each audience brought new perspectives and new opportunities to help people facing difficult family situations. At a women's conference in Seattle, I met a middle-aged woman whose adult daughter was emotionally manipulating her for money. At a legal seminar in Boston, I spoke with an attorney whose elderly father was being exploited by his much younger wife. At a medical conference in Miami, I counseled a doctor whose own children were pressuring her to retire and turn over her practice to them. The patterns are remarkably consistent, I often observed in my presentations. Family financial exploitation follows predictable tactics, which means it can be recognized and prevented. The recognition for my advocacy work had been gratifying but unexpected. I'd received awards from the State Bar Association, the Department of Aging, and several nonprofit organizations dedicated to elder rights. My story had been featured in magazines, newspapers, and documentaries about family abuse. Mrs. Williams, you've become the face of elder abuse prevention, noted a reporter who'd interviewed me for a national magazine article. How does it feel to be famous for something you never wanted to experience? It feels like making the best of a bad situation, I replied. I couldn't control what my children did to me, but I could control what I did with that experience afterward. The most meaningful recognition, however, came from the people whose lives had been changed by my story and advocacy work. Letters arrived regularly from seniors who'd avoided financial exploitation after learning about the warning signs. Adult children wrote to thank me for helping them recognize their own problematic behavior toward aging parents. Social workers and attorneys credited my presentations with helping them better identify and address family abuse cases. Your courage in speaking out has created a ripple effect that's protecting countless families, Dr. Chen told me as we prepared for another research presentation. You've turned your personal trauma into a social movement. My relationship with my grandchildren through Michael had also deepened in unexpected ways. Emma, now 16, had started volunteering at the community center and was considering a career in social work. Jake, 14, had developed a passion for elder law and often accompanied me to legal conferences. Grandma, you taught me that family relationships should be based on respect, not obligation. Emma told me as we worked together preparing materials for a support group meeting. That's a lesson I'll carry with me forever. And you taught me that standing up to bullies is important, even when those bullies are family members, Jake added. Especially when they're family members. The young people in my life had become some of my strongest advocates. They shared my story on social media, wrote school papers about elder abuse, and challenged their friends' assumptions about family loyalty and obligation. Grandma Nellie doesn't just talk about standing up for yourself. Emma had written in a blog post that went viral. She shows people how to do it with dignity and strength. My garden had become a metaphor for my new life. Where once I'd tended flowers alone, now my backyard was filled with vegetables that fed the people who attended support group meetings, herbs that went into meals I cooked for community center events, and flowers that brightened the spaces where I counseled other abuse survivors. Your garden feeds people's bodies and souls, observed Mrs. Chen, my neighbor who'd supported me through my darkest days and remained one of my closest friends. Gardens require patience, care, and protection from things that would damage them, I replied. Just like people do. The seasonal cycles of planting, tending, and harvesting had taught me important lessons about recovery and growth. Some plants thrived immediately while others took time to establish strong roots. Some flourished in full sun while others needed protection from harsh conditions. Some produced abundant fruit while others provided beauty without practical benefit. People are like plants, I often told the abuse survivors I counseled. We all have different needs and different timelines for healing, but we all have the capacity to grow and flourish under the right conditions. My kitchen had become the heart of my advocacy work, where important conversations happened over homemade meals, and where people felt safe enough to share their most painful experiences. I'd learned that feeding people was often the first step in helping them feel valued and worthy of protection. Mrs. Williams, your lasagna is almost as healing as your legal advice, joked Mr. Thompson, whose relationship with his daughter had been repaired through our intervention programs. Food is love made visible, I replied, refilling his plate. Everyone deserves to feel loved and nourished, especially people who've been betrayed by their families. The cookbook I was writing, featuring recipes shared during support group meetings, along with stories of recovery and resilience, had become a way to preserve the wisdom and experiences of the community I'd helped create. Each recipe tells a story of survival and strength. I explained to my editor, food connects us to our humanity when other people have tried to dehumanize us. As I approached my 70th birthday, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that day in the emergency room, when I'd clutched my chest and thought about the medical bills my children would soon receive. The woman who'd been dismissed and manipulated by her own family had become a nationally recognized advocate for elder rights and family dignity. Patricia, you've lived 3 lifetimes in these past few years, Dr. Goldstein observed during our regular therapy session. The woman who was betrayed by her children, the woman who fought back and protected herself, and now the woman who's protecting countless others. I think that's what resilience really means, I replied. It's not just bouncing back from trauma. It's using that trauma to become someone stronger and more purposeful than you were before. The foundation I'd established with the settlement money from David's case had grown into a major funding source for elder abuse prevention programs across the country. We'd helped establish legal clinics, fund research, train law enforcement, and support survivors, with everything from temporary housing to long-term counseling. Your children's betrayal has prevented thousands of other betrayals, Carmen observed as we reviewed the Foundation's annual report. That's the ultimate victory. My legacy was no longer about the inheritance I might leave to ungrateful children. It was about the systems I'd helped create to protect vulnerable elderly people, the awareness I'd raised about family financial exploitation, and the example I'd set for standing up to abuse regardless of its source. Mrs. Williams, you've shown the world that age doesn't mean accepting mistreatment, said Judge Patricia Morrison, the family court judge who'd handled David's criminal case and had become a strong advocate for elder rights legislation. "I've shown the world that dignity isn't negotiable," I replied. "Not even with family members." As I prepared for my 70th birthday celebration, surrounded by the chosen family I'd created through my advocacy work, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this point. The betrayal that had once felt like the end of my world had actually been the beginning of my most meaningful and impactful years. "Happy birthday, Mrs. Williams," called out the crowd of friends, colleagues, and fellow survivors who'd gathered in my backyard for the celebration. "Thank you for showing us how to fight back with grace and strength." Looking around at the faces of people whose lives had been touched and changed by my story, I realized that my children's attempt to diminish me had actually revealed my true power. They'd wanted to make me small and dependent, but their betrayal had made me large and influential. "Thank you all for helping me turn my pain into purpose," I replied, raising my glass in a toast. "Here's to the family we choose, and the strength we find in each other." The sunset painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink as my 70th birthday celebration continued into the evening. My house was filled with laughter, conversation, and the kind of unconditional love and support I'd always deserved but had to learn to demand. Whiskers, now an elderly cat himself, surveyed the scene from his favorite perch on the porch railing, purring contentedly as the people who'd become his extended family enjoyed the evening together. As the last guest departed and I cleaned up the remnants of the celebration, I reflected on the question Dr. Chen had posed earlier in the evening. "Patricia, if you could go back and change what happened with your children, would you?" "No," I'd answered without hesitation. Their betrayal revealed who they truly were, but it also revealed who I could become. I wouldn't trade the woman I am now for the woman I was before, even if it meant avoiding all the pain. The truth was that my children's cruelty had been the catalyst for the most fulfilling period of my life. Their attempt to steal my independence had taught me to value and protect it fiercely. Their dismissal of my worth had motivated me to prove my value to myself and to the world. Standing in my kitchen, washing dishes, and planning the next day's activities at the community center, I felt a deep sense of peace and purpose that had nothing to do with family approval or conventional success. I had built a life based on my own values and choices, surrounded by people who respected and cherished me for who I was rather than what I could provide them. My phone buzzed with a text message from Emma. "Grandma, thank you for the best birthday party ever. You inspire me every day to be strong and kind, and never let anyone diminish my worth. I love you." Reading her words, I realized that the most important legacy I was leaving wasn't about elder abuse prevention or advocacy work, though those things mattered enormously. The most important legacy was showing the young people in my life that they had the power to stand up for themselves, to demand respect, and to build lives based on their own values, rather than other people's expectations. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to bed, I passed the framed photograph of Robert that still sat on my mantelpiece. "I hope you're proud of what I've become," I whispered to his smiling image. "Our children tried to break me, but instead they helped me discover just how strong I really am." The house settled into peaceful quiet around me, and I fell asleep surrounded by the security I'd fought so hard to protect, and the purpose I'd discovered in the process. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to help other people find their own strength and dignity, new chances to turn pain into power, and new reminders that the best revenge against those who try to diminish us is living a life of meaning and impact despite their efforts. My children had been too busy for my drama, so I'd created drama too big for anyone to ignore. But in the end, it wasn't drama at all. It was justice, healing, and the transformation of one woman's betrayal into countless other people's protection and empowerment. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.